Imagine an empire so powerful it believed itself eternal, and a boy so mad and divine that he nearly destroyed it for sheer pleasure. His name was Elagabalus, the emperor who turned Rome into a spectacle of lust, blood, and blasphemy. At just 14 years old, he already had the world at his feet, crowned not by merit, but by intrigue, manipulation, and desire. And what did he do with that power? Nothing less than rewrite every moral rule of the most feared empire in history. They say he dressed as a woman, married men, offered human sacrifices at banquets, and turned the imperial palace into a temple of forbidden pleasures. Was he a god, a madman, or just a boy who grew up believing he could do anything? The Senate hated him, the soldiers feared him, and the people watched in horror as Roman morality crumbled. He appointed priests and concubines, changed gender before everyone, and declared himself the wife of Jupiter. Elagabalus didn't rule, he prophesied chaos. Today, we're diving into the story of this boy emperor who shocked the ancient world with his perversion and madness. But be warned, what you're about to hear is not for the faint of heart. Get ready, because the final revelation will leave you speechless. Before we continue, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It's not just a symbolic gesture. On YouTube, your subscription is what keeps this kind of rare, historical, and controversial content alive. It tells the platform that you want videos unafraid to speak the truth, to challenge taboos, and to dive deep into the hidden history of humanity. And tell me in the comments, which part of this story surprises you more? The boy who wanted to be a goddess, or the empire that let him rule? Stay until the end, because the final revelation about Elagabalus's fate will deeply shock you. Elagabalus was born in 203 AD in the ancient city of Emesa, now Homs, in Syria. His birth name was Sextus Varius Avitus Bassianus, and ironically, he could never have imagined that one day he would be called Lord of the World. He was just a boy, raised among golden temples and mysterious rituals, belonging to a powerful but non-imperial family. Fate, however, seemed to conspire in his favor from an early age. His mother, Julia Soaemius, and especially his grandmother, Julia Massa, belonged to one of the most influential families in the Roman East, connected by blood to the powerful Severan dynasty. When Emperor Caracalla was assassinated in 217, the throne was left vacant, plunging Rome into uncertainty. That was when the shrewd Julia Massa saw the perfect opportunity to turn her teenage grandson into emperor. The story of the coup that brought him to power is almost unbelievable. A combination of political intrigue, feminine ambition, and religious manipulation. Julia Massa spread the rumor that her grandson, the young priest of the sun god Elagabalus, was in fact the illegitimate son of Caracalla, the former emperor. The news spread like wildfire among the Roman legions in Syria, who still revered Caracalla as a hero. The idea of having a divine son back on the throne ignited the soldiers' imagination, and soon the 14-year-old boy was proclaimed emperor by the Eastern troops. Thus began one of the most bizarre ascents in history. The coronation was not a mere political act, it was a religious spectacle. Elagabalus was presented not just as a ruler, but as the living incarnation of the sun god Sol Invictus, known in his homeland as Elagabalus. From the very first day, he believed himself chosen by the gods, and that conviction would shape his entire destiny, transforming a shy boy into a sovereign convinced of his absolute divine power. Upon arriving in Rome, he brought not only armies but also the Eastern cult of Elagabalus, with its extravagant rituals, music, incense, and sacrifices. The Senate was horrified. The young emperor spoke little of politics but endlessly of faith. He spent hours in temples, wearing feminine garments and offering sacrifices to the sun. His gaze, they said, had a disturbing brightness, a mixture of childish innocence and messianic madness. And despite his age, he understood something many adults never would. Power lies not only in the sword, but in the spectacle. Julia Massa, his grandmother, acted behind the scenes as the true empress mother. She was the one who secured alliances, bribed generals, and eliminated rivals. But over time, even she could no longer control her grandson. The boy she had placed on the throne began to believe he was greater than Rome, greater than the old gods, and that the world should bow before his new faith. His youth did not stop him from ruling with arrogance. On the contrary, it made him even more unpredictable. He liked to test limits, provoke senators, and challenge the traditions that had sustained the empire for centuries. He was a child with the power of a god and the mind of a chaotic artist. His days were divided between religious ceremonies and palace feasts, where luxury intertwined with mysticism. He believed the empire needed to be purified by the light of Elagabalus, even if that meant destroying the legacy of Rome's ancient gods. To many, he was just a lost boy. To others, a deranged prophet. The empire, accustomed to military discipline, was now ruled by a boy who made faith and pleasure the pillars of power. And deep down, perhaps Elagabalus did not want to rule Rome. He wanted to transform it. He wanted the world to see the same light that consumed him from within, even if that light was made of fire. And so began the most controversial era of the Severan dynasty, marked by a brief but unforgettable reign, where religion and desire fused into a single flame. In the eyes of the Romans, that Syrian teenager was not an emperor, he was a living scandal. And the most terrifying part was that he was only just beginning. When Elagabalus arrived in Rome, he did not come merely to rule, he came to convert the entire empire to the faith he believed was the only true one. In his eyes, the sun was not just a distant star, it was the beating heart of the universe, the source of all life, the very God manifested in light and fire. And he, Elagabalus, saw himself as the chosen one, the earthly representative of this cosmic divinity. Dressed in robes embroidered with gold and precious stones, the young emperor assumed the title of High Priest of the sun god Sol Invictus, also called Elagabalus, and swore that Rome would never be the same again. For the senators and generals accustomed to the restraint of traditional Roman cults, what followed was a total shock. Suddenly, the serene temples of the Roman gods were replaced by exuberant Eastern ceremonies filled with incense, music, and dance. Elagabalus ordered the construction of a new sanctuary, the temple of the Elagabalium on the Palatine Hill, the most sacred point in the city. There, the sun god would be worshipped above all others, including Jupiter, the king of the gods. For the Romans, this was an unforgivable blasphemy. But for Elagabalus, it was the beginning of a new spiritual era, where the body and pleasure were divine expressions of creation. He believed that flesh and spirit were not in conflict but in perfect harmony, and that physical pleasure was a form of communion with the divine. During ceremonies, he danced with Syrian priests covered in gold and colorful veils to the sound of drums and flutes. Accounts say that during these rituals, the blood of sacrifices ran down the temple steps as the young emperor, possessed by religious ecstasy, proclaimed that blood was the language of the gods. He believed that suffering and passion together were the pathways to divine ecstasy. And to many, that vision marked the beginning of madness. Senators, forced to attend the ceremonies, were horrified by what they witnessed. Elagabalus made Rome's most respected elders bow before the sacred black stone of Emesa, symbol of the sun god, brought from Syria in a triumphant procession. That stone, he claimed, had fallen from the sky, a gift from the god himself. During celebrations, he appeared in public wearing women's clothing, adorned with makeup and jewels, often barefoot, dancing in a trance before the crowd. The Romans didn't know whether they were witnessing a prophet or a madman. The imperial palace became a permanent temple, and the emperor began gathering priests from across the empire. He wanted to create a universal religion, a fusion of all faiths with the sun at its center. To the people, Rome was no longer the city of gods, but the altar of a boy who believed he was one. This mixture of faith and pleasure grew more intense by the day. In the nocturnal rituals, wine flowed like water, bodies mingled in erotic dances, and the emperor, in ecstasy, declared that pleasure brought him closer to the god within. The ceremonies ceased to be mere acts of worship and became spectacles of sensuality, music, and blood. The boundaries between religion and desire were completely erased. It was as if Rome had been transported to another world, one where the sacred and the profane walked hand in hand. Elagabalus believed the body was the purest temple in the universe, and that denying pleasure was an offense to the gods. Thus, he became the first emperor to openly merge sexuality and faith, transforming the palace into a sanctuary of freedom and scandal. To him, there was no sin, only transformation. But to the Romans, this was the moral collapse of the empire. Many began whispering that the young emperor had been possessed by the sun itself, and that Rome was cursed. Even so, he remained convinced that he was leading the world into a new age of enlightenment. In his mind, human sacrifices, excess, and orgies were not acts of madness, but of devotion. He saw blood, sex, and ecstasy as bridges to the divine, a vision both profound and perilous. And the deeper he sank into that mystical abyss, the further he drifted from political reality, drawing ever closer to the chaos that was about to consume him. Rome, once the symbol of order and reason, now pulsed to the frenzied rhythm of Eastern drums and the golden glow of a god who demanded pleasure and blood. And the young emperor, lost between faith and delirium, seemed to believe he could transform the entire empire into a mirror of himself, a mirror of light, desire, and destruction. Rome was already shocked by the solar cult and the bloody rituals of the young emperor, but the true scandal was yet to come. If the Roman people thought Elagabalus was merely a religious fanatic, they would soon discover that he was much more than that, a born provocateur, a free spirit who recognized no limits, no laws, not even those of human nature. Still a teenager, he began to treat the throne not as a symbol of power, but as a stage for experimentation. His life became a theater where pleasure, scandal, and identity collided explosively. In an empire that valued virility, discipline, and masculine dominance, Elagabalus dared to challenge everything Rome held sacred. He married multiple times, not only women but also men, slaves, and even a gladiator. And the most shocking of all, in public he demanded to be addressed as Empress. He didn't want to be the lord of the empire, he wanted to be its goddess. When he appeared at ceremonies, he wore translucent silk robes, covered his face in golden makeup, and wore oriental wigs. He claimed to be the reincarnation of Venus, the goddess of love. His quest for physical transformation went beyond fantasy. Historians report that Elagabalus offered vast sums of money to doctors and surgeons who could transform him completely into a woman. He promised gold, lands, and titles to anyone who could give him the body he believed he deserved. This obsession with identity, in a time when the concept didn't even exist, scandalized Roman society. Many saw him as a degenerate, others as a visionary trapped in the wrong body. But regardless of interpretation, it's undeniable that he was the first ruler in history to openly defy the boundaries of gender and the power of imperial masculinity. His marriages were true spectacles. One day he would marry a priestess, weeks later a slave, then a muscular gladiator whom he flaunted as a trophy at banquets. He called his guests subjects of the empress and handed out pearls, rings, and even estates to those who praised him fervently. Elagabalus's banquets became legendary. While previous emperors celebrated military victories, he celebrated pleasure in all its forms. He ordered the preparation of extravagant feasts where wine flowed like rivers and dishes were adorned with gold and gemstones. Records say he crushed pearls to mix into his wine and sprinkled powdered gold over fruit, simply to show his contempt for convention and his belief that nothing, not even wealth, held value beyond pleasure. During these feasts, Rome's elite was torn between fascination and horror. Some attended merely to witness the emperor's spectacle, others to ensure their heads remained attached. And there was everything: nude dancers, Eastern musicians, exotic animals, rare perfumes, and an emperor draped in jewels, reclining on beds of petals, surrounded by men and women. He made no distinctions. He believed all bodies were sacred and that pleasure was the only true form of freedom. The imperial palace, once a symbol of Roman authority, became a mix between a temple and a house of pleasures. To the old aristocracy, it was the end of morality, the collapse of dignity. But to Elagabalus, it was the liberation from the hypocrisy that had ruled Rome for centuries. He saw pleasure not as sin, but as an offering. Every sexual act, every banquet, every provocation was an act of devotion to the sun god and the goddess of love. Elagabalus believed he was revealing to the world the true nature of existence, a fusion of the spiritual and the carnal, the sacred and the profane. His curiosity and courage to explore what no one else dared made him as feared as he was fascinating. But that freedom came at a high price. The Senate saw him as a threat, the generals despised him, and the people began whispering that the gods had abandoned Rome. Even so, he did not retreat. Every criticism seemed to fuel him, as if hatred were the fuel for his personal revolution. He wanted to be remembered, even if it was as the emperor who destroyed his own empire in the name of pleasure. And in a way, he succeeded. His life became a kind of divine performance, a continuous act of provocation against everything and everyone. And while Rome burned with rumors, Elagabalus danced at the center of chaos, illuminated by the light of the god he claimed lived within him. Elagabalus never knew love the way other men did. For him, love was not merely a feeling, it was a divine experience, an offering, a celebration of life and power. From a very young age, surrounded by priestesses and dancers, he believed that every touch carried spiritual meaning. Thus, when he became emperor, the Roman palace ceased to be just a political center and turned into a true empire of pleasure, where body, art, and devotion became indistinguishable. His lovers came from all corners of the empire: priests of the sun cult, Greek musicians, stage actors, and even soldiers who once served him. Elagabalus made no distinctions. What attracted him was not origin but energy, gaze, desire. He said every person carried a divine spark within, and that by uniting with them, he was connecting directly to the gods. That was how he met Hierocles, a Greek charioteer with a fiery personality and athletic body, who became the great love of his life, and also the beginning of his downfall. Elagabalus fell madly in love. Hierocles was rough, impulsive, but had something the emperor had never experienced before. Someone who challenged him. In public, the charioteer called him "my wife" and treated him as such. The emperor's submission before him shocked all of Rome. At banquets, Elagabalus sat at Hierocles' feet, kissed his hands, and allowed himself to be humiliated before the senators. For an empire built upon pride and virility, that scene was an unforgivable affront. The Senate saw in him not only a corrupted ruler, but the living symbol of Rome's moral decay. Yet the young emperor seemed increasingly enchanted by this reversal of roles. He said true pleasure lay in freeing oneself from every form of control, including control over one's own ego. What others saw as humiliation, he saw as transcendence. Inside the palace, life was a constant blend of sacred rites and carnal desires. Every night, the halls were lit by torches and perfumed with Eastern incense. Musicians played slow melodies while dancers and young priests moved around fountains where wine and milk flowed like rivers. The emperor presided over these ceremonies with Hierocles by his side, both dressed in silk robes and crowned with flowers. In certain rituals, the blood of sacrifices mingled with the scent of incense and the sweat of bodies dancing in ecstasy. The palace had become a microcosm of Elagabalus's inner world, a space where faith and pleasure were inseparable. But outside its walls, Rome boiled with outrage. Senators whispered, generals plotted, and even the people who once watched with curiosity began to revolt. The empire's treasury was being drained by feasts and offerings, and Rome's reputation, once a symbol of order and might, was dissolving in scandal. Even so, Elagabalus continued to believe he was enlightening the world. To him, pleasure was a cosmic force, a manifestation of the divine. Every relationship he had was a ritual, and every lover an altar. When not with Hierocles, he involved himself with priests, gladiators, actors, women, and young slaves. With each new love, he created a different ceremony, as if every passion were a new religion. But not even the gods could protect one who defied tradition so boldly. Intrigues began to pile up. Some of his lovers betrayed him in exchange for political favors. Others were murdered out of jealousy within the palace itself. And Hierocles, the man who dominated him, began to abuse his power. He humiliated officers, interfered in decisions, and behaved like the true emperor. Their relationship, once built on passion, turned into a war of manipulation. Still, Elagabalus seemed blind. His advisors tried to warn him, but he wouldn't listen. He was too deeply immersed in the world he had created, a world where love was king, pleasure was faith, and reality was only a distant shadow. As the days passed, the palace became a sanctuary of delirium. The orgies were daily, the banquets endless, and the betrayals inevitable. The corridors echoed with laughter, moans, and broken promises. Outside, the empire began to crumble slowly, while the young emperor believed he was closer to the gods than ever before. In his heart, Elagabalus still saw love as a sacred force, but he no longer realized that love can also destroy. And it was precisely this confusion between passion and power that opened the path to his ruin. The empire that Elagabalus believed he ruled through the light of the gods had become an abyss. Rome, once a symbol of discipline and glory, now breathed the heavy air of decadence. The streets buzzed with rumors, senators conspired in silence, and the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers tasked with protecting the emperor, began to doubt their own loyalty. The boy who had once ascended the throne as a divine prodigy was now seen as a threat to the empire's very survival. And what pained the Romans most was that he seemed completely unaware of it. While political chaos grew, Elagabalus remained absorbed in his rituals, feasts, and affairs, convinced that the gods were still with him. But faith, when detached from reality, can turn into delusion, and that was exactly what happened. Rome was exhausted. The Senate despised him, the people feared him, and even his grandmother, Julia Maesa, the very woman who had placed him on the throne, began to see that the empire was collapsing under the weight of his excesses. It was she, some accounts claim, who began to orchestrate the coup that would end her own grandson's reign. And the instrument of his downfall would be the Praetorian Guard, the same military body that had crowned him only a few years earlier. At 18 years old, Elagabalus was no longer the enchanted boy who believed in the power of the sun. He was a paranoid young man, surrounded by invisible enemies, unable to distinguish devotion from betrayal. He spent entire nights locked in his chambers, performing ceremonies to ask for divine protection, but not even the gods could save him from reality. The generals met in secret, the soldiers revolted, and the conspiracy finally took shape. At first, he didn't believe it. He laughed at the threats and called cowards those who spoke of rebellion. But on the day the shouts echoed through the palace corridors, laughter turned to despair. The Praetorian Guard had risen. The gates were broken down, and the soldiers, once his protectors, now marched against him with fury and vengeance. What followed was a scene worthy of a tragedy. Elagabalus tried to flee, running through the palace halls draped in silk, calling for his mother and the gods, but there was no one left to hear him. His own mother, Julia Soaemius, tried to shield him, begging the soldiers for mercy, but it was useless. The empire no longer wanted redemption, it wanted blood. The young emperor was captured and dragged by his hair before his enemies. There was no trial, no speech, only the metallic sound of swords and the silence of those who watched. Some accounts say he begged for his life, promising to abdicate the throne. Others claim he died screaming the name of Elagabal, the god he believed was his soul. But all agree on one thing: the end was brutal. His body was stabbed, mutilated, and dragged through the streets of Rome, displayed as a trophy of moral victory over chaos. The crowd, which had once watched him with curiosity and fear, now applauded in rage, as if trying to erase from memory everything he had represented. The body of Elagabalus was thrown on the steps of the Capitoline Hill, then dragged to the Tiber River, the same river Rome used to cleanse its sins. There, amid mud, debris, and silence, ended the empire of the boy who thought himself a god. There was no funeral, no rites, no burial, only cold water and oblivion. The contrast was cruel. The one who had proclaimed himself the living sun, the symbol of eternal light, now vanished into the river's shadows. It was as if fate itself wanted to teach him the final lesson, that no man, no matter how powerful, can defy the gods, tradition, and time. The sun he so deeply worshipped continued to rise over Rome, indifferent to his fall. And even in death, Elagabalus divided opinions. To some, a monster; to others, a martyr of his own madness. His death was not merely the end of an emperor, it was the end of an era. An entire empire had witnessed how far power can go when mixed with delusion and desire. The Eternal City washed its hands, but it could never completely erase the memory of that Syrian boy who dared to challenge all the gods of Rome. Centuries have passed, empires have risen and fallen, but the name of Elagabalus has never completely disappeared. He remains an unsettling ghost that crosses through time, defying the concepts of morality, power, and identity. For some, he is the ultimate symbol of Roman decadence, living proof that excess destroys even the mightiest of empires. For others, he is a tragic, almost mystical figure, a young man who dared to be himself in an age that did not forgive difference. The boy who claimed to carry a god within him became, in a way, immortal. His story is the mirror of human contradictions, the desire to be free and the fear of the consequences of that freedom. For centuries, Elagabalus's image was painted by his enemies, conservative historians, outraged senators, and Christian moralists who saw in him the embodiment of sin. They called him a monster, a pervert, a madman, and a blasphemer. The chronicles of his life were written with contempt, turning him into a warning for future generations about the dangers of power without limits. But as time passed and the world changed, his figure began to be reinterpreted. Modern artists, philosophers, and writers came to see him not as a demon, but as a symbol of transgression, a spirit ahead of his time who defied gender roles, religious rigidity, and Rome's moral hypocrisy. In the 19th century, symbolist painters depicted him in golden hues, surrounded by mystery and sensuality. Poets and writers of the 20th century began to describe him as the first human being to openly challenge the idea of a fixed identity. Some even called him the first queer emperor in history. He went from villain to icon, from a figure of decadence to the embodiment of absolute individual freedom. Yet the duality remains. For many, Elagabalus was proof that absolute power corrupts absolutely. For others, he was simply a young man who lived intensely in a time unprepared to understand him. The most fascinating part is that, despite dying at only 18, his presence continues to echo in art, philosophy, and even popular culture. His story inspires discussions about identity, gender, religion, and power. He is an uncomfortable mirror that forces us to look within and ask, how far can freedom go before it becomes destruction? Elagabalus lived as if the world were an offering, and he paid the highest price for it. His tragedy is the tragedy of us all, the eternal conflict between who we are and what the world expects us to be. Perhaps that is why, even after 2,000 years, we still speak of him. Because within every era, there is a little of Elagabalus, that untamable flame that wants to live without rules, feel without limits, and shine even if the light consumes it. And perhaps in the end, he was neither a monster nor a hero, just a mirror. A reflection of what happens when a boy with a god inside him has the entire world at his feet and discovers too late that even the sun needs its shadow. And that's how the story of Elagabalus ends, the boy who wanted to be a god and ended up being remembered as a myth. A story that transcends time and still challenges us to think, was he truly insane or simply too free for the world he was born into? What do you think? Leave your opinion in the comments. Was Elagabalus a misunderstood visionary or the ultimate symbol of human decadence? I'll be reading and replying to the most interesting comments because your point of view is also part of this conversation. If you've made it this far, my respect. That shows you're curious, that you enjoy exploring the hidden side of history, the one that books don't always tell. So go ahead and leave a like and subscribe to the channel because it truly makes a huge difference. On YouTube, subscribing is what keeps the channel alive. It's what tells the platform that this kind of content, which takes research, emotion, and time to create, deserves to keep reaching more people. And when you leave a like, YouTube understands that this video held your attention until the end and shares it with other curious minds like yours. So if you believe that stories like this shouldn't be forgotten, click subscribe now and turn on the notification bell. And tell me, which part of Elagabalus's life surprised you the most? Was it his madness, his courage, or his loneliness? And before you go, I'll leave you an invitation. Watch the video that's on the screen right now. It's even more intriguing and captivating than this one, and it'll show you another side of history that no one dares to tell. I guarantee you, if Elagabalus's story impressed you, the next one will leave you completely speechless.